They say the desert erases everything, but sometimes it leaves behind a message meant to be found. Death Valley, California, a land of extremes, the hottest, driest, and lowest national park in the United States. It's a place that can be both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. For 20 years, this vast, silent expanse has held a chilling secret, a mystery etched not in stone, but into the hearts of a grieving family. In the summer of 2004, two twin brothers, Jake and Sam Turner, vanished without a trace while on a hiking trip. They were experienced campers, young and full of life, with a love for the wild that was matched only by their bond as brothers. The search for them was massive, a relentless effort that turned up nothing. No bodies, no clues, no sign of what happened. The desert had swallowed them whole. Until a group of climbers made a discovery that shattered the silence of 2 decades and brought the nightmare roaring back to life. Where are you watching this from? Think about the people you are closest to, the ones you share your most precious memories with. Now imagine if they vanished, not from the world, but from your life, leaving behind only questions and an endless void. That's the terrifying reality of what happened to the Turner family. Jake and Sam were identical twins, inseparable since birth. They were 22 years old, recent college graduates, and were planning one last big adventure before starting their careers. Their plan was to spend a week hiking and camping in Death Valley, a trip they had been planning for months. It was meant to be an epic conclusion to their youth, a final hurrah before the responsibilities of adulthood set in. Your support helps us bring you more haunting mysteries you won't find anywhere else. So if you haven't yet, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It's a small act that makes a huge difference. The timeline of their disappearance is deceptively simple. On July 15, 2004, they checked in with the park rangers at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center, stating their planned route and estimated time of return. They were well prepared with plenty of water, food, and the necessary gear. They were last seen by another group of hikers near the Golden Canyon trailhead, laughing and taking photos. The weather was a typical Death Valley summer day, scorching hot, but the twins were seasoned hikers and knew the risks. They were last sighted heading into the canyon, a place known for its stunning rock formations and labyrinthine paths. Their car was found a week later, untouched in the Golden Canyon parking lot. The key was in the ignition, their gear was still inside, and a half-eaten bag of chips lay on the dashboard. It was as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. A massive search operation was launched, involving helicopters, ground teams, and cadaver dogs. They scoured every inch of the canyon, every crevice, every cliff face. But there was no sign of the twins. The desert, in its vast, silent indifference, had kept its secret. The case went cold, and the twins' disappearance became a modern-day urban legend, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. But 20 years later, in the summer of 2024, a group of climbers scaling a remote, rarely visited cliff face in an area far from the Golden Canyon made a discovery that shocked the world. Etched into the side of the cliff, 100 feet up, were 2 names, Jake Turner and Sam Turner. And the names were crudely carved, as if with a rock, but there was no doubt as to who they belonged to. It was a discovery that not only reignited the cold case, but also raised a terrifying new question. How did their names, and presumably the twins themselves, get to a remote cliff face 100 miles from their last known location? The desert hadn't erased them after all. It had just been waiting for the right moment to reveal a final, terrifying message. The desert doesn't just hide secrets, it slowly reveals them, grain by grain, as if speaking through the very sand and stone. The discovery of Jake and Sam Turner's names carved into the remote cliff wall sent a tremor through the quiet communities surrounding Death Valley. For 2 decades, their disappearance had been a closed book, a tragedy filed away as an unfortunate accident of the wilderness. Now, a single undeniable piece of evidence had ripped that book open. The park rangers, who had led the initial fruitless search, were stunned. The location of the carving was hundreds of miles from the Golden Canyon trailhead where the twins were last seen, in an area so treacherous and rarely visited that it barely had any established trails. How could they have gotten there? And why would they carve their names into a cliff face? It wasn't a distress signal, it was a memorial. The initial investigation into the carving was meticulous. Forensic teams scaled the cliff, carefully examining the crude etchings. They confirmed that the carvings were indeed old, consistent with having been made approximately 20 years prior. They also found faint traces of what appeared to be human skin cells in the crevices of the carvings, too degraded for DNA analysis, but strong enough to suggest direct human contact. There were no signs of modern tools, supporting the theory that the names had been carved with whatever hard objects the twins might have had on hand, perhaps a sharp rock or a piece of metal. This ruled out a modern hoax, solidifying the terrifying reality. Jake and Sam had been there. The new evidence forced the National Park Service and local law enforcement to reopen the cold case. They brought in new investigators, specialists in desert survival and remote area searches. Their first task was to re-evaluate the initial search operation. Had they missed something? Had the twins, against all odds, managed to traverse an impossible distance across the brutal desert landscape? The new teams pored over old maps, satellite imagery, and weather data from 2004. They calculated the extreme heat, the limited water sources, and the sheer impossibility of surviving such a journey on foot. The prevailing theory was that the twins had somehow been transported to this remote location. But by whom and why? The families of Jake and Sam, who had spent 2 decades in agonizing uncertainty, were plunged back into a whirlwind of grief and renewed hope. Their parents, now older and wearier, clung to the possibility that some part of their son's final moments might finally be revealed. They provided new details, old photographs, and recounted every memory of the twins, hoping to jog a forgotten detail that might connect the pieces. They described Jake as the more pragmatic and cautious twin, while Sam was the adventurous and impulsive one. This distinction, though subtle, would become important. If they had to choose, it would be Sam who would push for a daring off-trail adventure. Investigators revisited the car, the Ford pickup truck left untouched at the Golden Canyon parking lot. The key was still in the ignition, and their hiking gear, including their water bottles, was inside. This was a critical detail. Seasoned hikers, especially in Death Valley, would never leave their water behind. It suggested they had planned a short excursion, not a multi-day journey across the desert. But if they had only planned a short hike, how did they end up so far away? The car's location created a paradox. It anchored them to one spot, while the carved names pulled them hundreds of miles away. It was as if 2 separate realities existed for the brothers, one that ended at their car, and another that led to a remote cliff face. The reopening of the case reignited public interest, drawing attention from across the country. Speculation ran wild. Was it a cult, a serial killer preying on hikers, or something even more bizarre, a supernatural phenomenon in a place known for its eerie, almost otherworldly landscape? The desert, once a silent guardian of secrets, was now whispering a new story, a tale of 2 brothers who had disappeared into thin air, only to leave behind a chilling message etched in stone, a final desperate cry for help from a place where no one would ever think to look. The mystery of Death Valley had just begun to unfold, revealing that some vanishings are not accidents, but carefully constructed puzzles. The desert has a way of twisting perception, making the familiar strange and the impossible terrifyingly real. For Jake and Sam Turner, their final journey began with an illusion. The location of the carved names, so far removed from the twins' last known position, presented an insurmountable logistical challenge to the initial narrative. It was physically impossible for them to have walked such a distance in the scorching Death Valley summer without sufficient water or gear. This led investigators to a chilling, yet unavoidable conclusion. The twins did not reach that cliff face on their own power. They were either transported there, or they were taken there. This shifted the entire focus of the reopened investigation from a search and rescue to a potential abduction or foul play. Investigators meticulously re-examined the initial park ranger reports and witness statements. The last confirmed sighting of Jake and Sam was near the Golden Canyon trailhead. Another group of hikers had seen them around noon, looking upbeat and ready for their adventure. But then a new detail emerged from the old files, a detail that had been dismissed as irrelevant at the time. A lone park ranger, patrolling a remote section of the park several miles from Golden Canyon, reported seeing a dusty, older model sedan parked unusually close to an unmarked, seldom-used dirt track. The ranger noted it briefly, thinking it was just a local off-roader, and continued his patrol. The report was filed and forgotten, a minor detail in a park larger than many states. Now that detail screamed for attention. If the twins' truck was at Golden Canyon, whose sedan was it? And why was it parked on a secluded track? The ranger, now retired, was contacted and interviewed again. His memory was hazy, but he recalled the sedan was a dark color, possibly blue or black, and looked somewhat out of place. He couldn't remember the license plate, but he remembered a subtle detail, a faded, almost invisible sticker on the rear bumper, perhaps from a local dive bar or a tourist trap. This was a fragile thread, but in the vastness of Death Valley, any thread was a lifeline. The new investigation also focused on the timeline. The twins had checked in with the park rangers at Furnace Creek Visitor Center, stating their planned route and estimated time of return. They were due back on July 22nd. Their truck was found on July 23rd. This meant they had been missing for at least a week before anyone realized they hadn't returned. In Death Valley, a week is an eternity. It's enough time for the harsh environment to erase nearly all traces of human presence. But what if someone had used that time, not to search, but to hide? The remote cliff carving itself became a subject of intense analysis. The crude nature of the names suggested a desperate act, perhaps the last act of two men stranded and facing their end. But the height, 100 feet up, begged the question, how did they get there? Was there a natural ledge, a hidden path that climbers would know about but not casual hikers? Experienced climbers were brought in to survey the area. They confirmed that while challenging, it was possible to scale that section of the cliff with basic climbing skills, but it would have been an arduous and dangerous climb for anyone without proper equipment, especially in the heat. This introduced a new, chilling hypothesis. The twins, after somehow being transported to this remote area, might have attempted to climb the cliff in a desperate attempt to find higher ground, a better vantage point, or perhaps even a way out. This painted a terrifying picture. Two brothers, lost and alone, using their last reserves of strength to carve their names into a rock face, a final testament to their existence, a silent message to a world that had forgotten them. The desert, with its endless horizons, now seemed to shrink, closing in on a terrible secret that was slowly, painfully coming to light. The carving was not just a symbol of their disappearance, it was a window into their final, desperate moments. The desert holds many secrets, but the most unsettling ones are often whispered by the wind, carrying fragments of stories that refuse to die. The reopened investigation into Jake and Sam Turner's disappearance began to unearth not just new clues, but old whispers. Local legends and anecdotes about Death Valley, often dismissed as mere folklore, now took on a darker, more ominous tone. There were tales of isolated desert dwellers, survivalists, and even small, secretive cults rumored to inhabit the vast, uncharted regions of the park. While most of these stories were unsubstantiated, the idea that someone else, someone with an intimate knowledge of the desert's hidden corners, might have been involved, suddenly seemed chillingly plausible. Investigators meticulously reviewed every piece of discarded evidence from the initial search. One detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, caught the eye of a new detective. A faded, crumpled piece of paper found near the Golden Canyon parking lot, just a few yards from the twins' truck. It was a torn corner of a map, not a standard park map, but a hand-drawn, highly detailed map of a specific remote section of Death Valley. The map showed hidden springs, rough tracks, and even a few marked caves, places that wouldn't appear on any official Park Service document. The paper was old, weather-beaten, and had a distinctive, almost archaic quality to its drawing style. This map fragment was a game-changer. It suggested that the twins might have been planning an off-trail excursion, a deviation from their stated route. This would explain how they ended up so far from their truck, but it still didn't explain the remote cliff carving or the complete lack of their bodies. The map was sent to a cartography expert who immediately recognized the style. It was similar to a series of hand-drawn maps made in the early 20th century by a legendary, reclusive prospector known only as Old Man Hemlock. Hemlock was rumored to have lived deep within Death Valley, discovering hidden springs and forgotten gold mines, leaving behind a trail of meticulously detailed, if highly personal, maps. The existence of this map fragment introduced a new, terrifying possibility. Had the twins encountered Old Man Hemlock, or someone who possessed his maps? Was Hemlock still alive, a hermit living off the grid, or had his maps fallen into the wrong hands? The reclusive nature of Hemlock and the fact that he was rumored to be fiercely protective of his solitude made this a deeply unsettling line of inquiry. The desert, which the twins loved, might have held a secret community, a hidden world that few outsiders ever saw or lived to tell about. Investigators began to search for any surviving relatives or associates of Old Man Hemlock. They found very little. Hemlock had been a true recluse, leaving no digital footprint, no paper trail. He was a ghost, a legend, a whisper in the wind. But the map fragment was undeniable. It was a tangible link to a hidden world, a world that the twins might have accidentally stumbled upon. The desert, which they had seen as a place of adventure, might have also been a place of ancient, unspoken rules, a place where intruders were not welcome. The new focus on Hemlock's maps painted a more nuanced picture of the twins' last known movements. Perhaps they weren't abducted from Golden Canyon. Perhaps they had willingly ventured off-trail, guided by a map they had acquired, eager to explore the uncharted territories of Death Valley. This would explain their absence from their truck, but it still left the chilling mystery of the carved names on the cliff. Why would they leave such a message? Was it a warning, a desperate plea, or a final defiant act of two brothers who knew their time was running out? The desert was beginning to reveal its secrets, but each revelation only deepened the terrifying enigma of Jake and Sam Turner. The desert has a memory. It doesn't just hold on to secrets. It remembers the people who walked its paths, and sometimes it leaves behind a final, heartbreaking clue to their fate. The discovery of Old Man Hemlock's hand-drawn map fragment was a significant breakthrough, but it still left a vast, gaping hole in the narrative. It explained how the twins might have ended up in a remote location, but it did not explain the chilling reality of their disappearance. Had they simply gotten lost? Had they succumbed to the elements? Or had they, as the evidence now suggested, encountered someone far more dangerous than the desert itself? The new team of investigators, armed with the map fragment, began a meticulous and dangerous search for Hemlock's rumored hideout, a place that might hold the key to the twins' final moments. The search was grueling. Death Valley is a labyrinth of canyons, caves, and treacherous terrain. The map fragment was a guide, but it was an ancient one, and the landscape had changed over 2 decades. But the investigators were persistent. They followed the faint trails, they looked for the hidden springs, and they scoured the caves marked on the map. After weeks of relentless searching, they found it. A small, secluded rock shelter, hidden in a crevice of a towering cliff face. It was not a grand hideout, but a simple, almost Spartan cave, a place where a hermit would live. It was filled with old, rusted prospecting tools, ancient camping gear, and a stack of weathered, hand-drawn maps. And on a small makeshift table, they found a single, solitary item that sent a chill down their spines. A half-finished journal. The journal, a small leather-bound book, was filled with a spidery, almost illegible handwriting. It was old Man Hemlock's journal. He wrote about his life in the desert, his love for the solitude, and his fierce protection of his privacy. And then he wrote about an encounter, a chance meeting with 2 young men. He didn't mention their names, but he described them in vivid detail. 2 of them, he wrote, identical as 2 drops of water. They came looking for adventure, but they were lost. Not in the desert, but in themselves. He wrote about how he had warned them, told them to turn back, to leave the desert alone. But they had a map, a copy of one of his own maps. He wrote about his fury, his rage at the thought that his secrets had been stolen, that his solitude had been violated. The journal painted a terrifying picture. Hemlock was not a killer, but he was a man who was deeply, dangerously possessive of his space. He saw the twins not as harmless adventurers, but as a threat, as an intrusion. He wrote about how he had followed them, how he had watched them from a distance, and how he had seen them get lost, their young, naive arrogance no match for the desert's unforgiving nature. The journal didn't describe a violent confrontation, but it described something far more sinister. A man who had chosen to do nothing, a man who had watched 2 young lives fade away, a man who had seen their desperation and had chosen to turn his back. And then, on the last page of the journal, there was a final cryptic entry. The cliffs are a testament. The twins found their way to the last spring. They used their last bit of strength to leave a message. They were not lost in the desert. They were lost to their own hubris. I watched them from above. They carved their names, a final act of defiance. The desert takes what it wants. This single entry connected the dots, a final, horrifying confirmation. The twins had not been abducted. They had been victims of their own ambition, their own overconfidence. They had ventured into a world they didn't understand, and they had paid the ultimate price. The carving was not a plea for help. It was a final, haunting act of defiance, a silent message from 2 brothers who had refused to be erased. The desert had not killed them. It had simply allowed them to find their own end. The case of the missing twins of Death Valley was finally solved, not by a murder investigation, but by a chilling, posthumous confession from a man who had watched them die. The desert does not judge. It simply is. And in its unyielding silence, it holds a truth more brutal than any act of violence, the truth of indifference. The discovery of old Man Hemlock's journal was both a relief and a new kind of agony for the Turner family. It answered the how and why of their son's disappearance, but it did so in a way that offered no comfort, no closure. It was not a tale of a savage murder or a tragic accident, but a chilling account of a man who had chosen to do nothing. A man who had watched 2 young lives fade away and had simply recorded it in a journal. The legal implications were complex. Hemlock was not a murderer in the traditional sense. He had not taken their lives, but he had allowed them to be taken. The question became, was his indifference a crime, and could it be proven in a court of law? The new team of investigators, armed with the journal and the maps, now had a new mission: to find old Man Hemlock. He was no longer a ghost from the past. He was a living witness, a key to understanding the final moments of Jake and Sam Turner. The maps in his cave were meticulously detailed, showing not just the hidden springs and trails, but also a series of unmarked caches, places where Hemlock had stored food, water, and supplies. It was a terrifying realization. Hemlock had not just watched them die, he had the means to save them and had chosen not to. This solidified the new, chilling theory. Hemlock's motive was not malice, but a fierce, almost deranged possessiveness of his solitude. The twins were not just intruders. They were a violation, a permanent scar on a world he had claimed as his own. The search for Hemlock was launched, a massive operation that utilized every available resource. Helicopters scoured the desert, drones with thermal imaging cameras flew over canyons, and ground teams with cadaver dogs combed every known trail and hidden crevice. The search was relentless, but Hemlock, a man who had lived off the grid for decades, was a ghost, a master of disappearing. He had lived his life to avoid detection, and he was using every ounce of his knowledge to stay hidden. But the investigators had a secret weapon, Hemlock's own maps. They were now in a game of cat and mouse, a deadly chase with a man who knew the desert better than anyone. The narrative of the twins' disappearance, which had been a tragic tale of two young adventurers, now became a horrifying story of a quiet, unpunished cruelty. The public, which had been captivated by the mystery, was now enraged by the revelations. They demanded justice for Jake and Sam, a retribution not just for their deaths, but for the callous indifference that had led to them. The media, which had once portrayed Hemlock as a romantic figure, a solitary hermit, now painted him as a monster. A man who had watched two young lives slip away and had chosen to do nothing. The desert, which had been a silent witness, was now a loud, angry jury. The case of the Turner twins was no longer just a cold case. It was a moral and legal battle, a debate about the nature of human responsibility and the line between a reclusive lifestyle and a criminal act of omission. The families, who had mourned for 20 years, now had a new kind of pain, the knowledge that their sons had not just been lost to the desert, but had been lost to a man's cold indifference. The final chapter of their story was still unwritten, a final act that would either bring a new kind of justice or leave an even more haunting void. The desert had spoken, but the final, most terrifying question had yet to be answered. Where was the man who had watched them die? The desert is a cruel mistress. It can protect a secret for decades, but when it decides to reveal it, it does so with a final, brutal flourish. The search for old man Hemlock, the hermit who had watched the Turner twins die, was a monumental failure. He was a ghost, a master of his domain, and he had vanished without a trace. The investigators, after months of relentless searching, were forced to admit defeat. Hemlock had won. He had proven that he could outsmart the system, that he could disappear into the very landscape he had claimed as his own. The case was now in a legal and moral limbo. They had a chilling journal, a posthumous confession, but they had no body, no witness, and no one to charge with a crime. The families were left with a new, more agonizing form of pain, the knowledge that the man who had the answers was out there, living free in the vast, unforgiving desert. The public, which had been so captivated by the mystery, was now enraged by the lack of justice. They demanded that the case be reopened, that more resources be allocated, that the government not give up on Jake and Sam. But the law, with its rigid rules and its need for physical evidence, was at a standstill. A crime of omission, a failure to act, was a difficult thing to prove, especially when the only witness was a dead man's journal and the only suspect was a ghost. The case of the Turner twins, which had been solved in spirit, was still an open case in the eyes of the law. The desert, which had been a silent witness, was now a loud, angry jury. But then a new, completely unexpected piece of evidence emerged. a detail so bizarre and so out of place that it had been dismissed for years. A team of geologists conducting a survey of the remote region where the twins' names had been carved made a startling discovery. They were using a new type of ground-penetrating radar, a technology that could see through layers of rock and sand. And what they found was a small, man-made cavity a few hundred feet from the cliff face, buried deep beneath the ground. It was not a cave, not a spring, but a burial site, and it had been filled in meticulously, as if to hide something. The geologists, intrigued by the anomaly, alerted the authorities. A team of forensic experts was dispatched to the remote site, a place that was so isolated that it had to be reached by helicopter. They began to excavate the site, a slow, painstaking process that was hampered by the harsh, unyielding terrain, and after days of digging, they found it. A small, carefully constructed rock tomb, a final resting place. And inside, they found two bodies perfectly preserved by the dry, arid conditions of the desert. The bodies were those of Jake and Sam Turner. They were not wearing their hiking gear, but were instead wrapped in old, dusty blankets. There were no signs of violence, no broken bones, no bullet wounds. They had simply succumbed to the elements, their bodies giving out from dehydration and exhaustion. But there was a single solitary clue that baffled everyone. Tucked inside the pocket of one of the boys was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note written in a spidery, almost illegible handwriting. It was a note from old Man Hemlock. The note was short and cryptic. It simply said, "Their journey is over. They have a final resting place. May they find peace in the silence of the desert." The note was not an apology, not a confession. It was a final, chilling act of a man who had chosen to be the twins' last witness, their final guardian. He had not just watched them die, he had buried them. He had given them a burial, a final resting place, a peace that he had denied them in life. The act was a paradox, a final, unsettling act of both cruelty and mercy. The case of the missing twins of Death Valley was finally undeniably solved. The desert had not just kept a secret, it had held a tomb. And now, after 20 years, it had finally given up its dead. The case was closed, but the haunting memory of the two boys and the strange, quiet man who had watched them die would forever be a part of Death Valley's chilling folklore. The truth, when it finally arrives, can be a different kind of pain. It doesn't heal the wound, but it allows the grieving to finally know where to place their memories. The discovery of Jake and Sam Turner's bodies was a final, devastating blow for their family. For 20 years, they had lived in a limbo of hope and despair. Now the hope was gone, replaced by a grim, unyielding reality. The bodies, perfectly preserved by the dry desert heat, were a heartbreaking sight. But the small, handwritten note found in Jake's pocket was a different kind of pain. It was a final, taunting message from a man who had chosen to be a witness to their deaths, a man who had chosen to do nothing. The legal battle that followed was unprecedented. The prosecution, armed with Hemlock's journal and the note, had a strong case. They argued that Hemlock was not just a hermit, but a monster. He had the means to save them, his hidden caches of food and water, but he had chosen to let them die. The defense, in turn, argued that Hemlock had committed no crime. He had not forced them into the desert, they had chosen to go there. His act of burying them was not a crime, but an act of mercy, a final, poignant gesture. The trial became a media circus, a national debate about the nature of human responsibility and the line between a reclusive lifestyle and a criminal act of omission. The Turner family was forced to relive their nightmare in the public eye. They sat in the courtroom listening to the chilling details of their son's final moments, a story told not by a detective, but by a journal. The journal detailed the twins' last days, their increasing desperation, their quiet, heartbreaking surrender to the elements. It described how they had used their last bit of strength to carve their names into the cliff face, a final act of defiance against a world that had forgotten them. Hemlock's spidery handwriting brought them to life, only to describe their deaths. It was a form of closure, but it was a cold, brutal kind. The verdict was a shock to the nation. Old Man Hemlock, still missing, was found guilty in absentia of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The legal precedent was groundbreaking. The jury had decided that his indifference was a criminal act, that his failure to act was a form of killing. The verdict was hailed as a victory for justice, a message that a person's responsibility to their fellow man extended beyond the boundaries of a civilized society, even in the unforgiving wilderness of Death Valley. But the victory was bittersweet. Hemlock was still at large, a fugitive living somewhere in the vast, silent expanse of the desert he had claimed as his own. The families, with their newfound closure, finally had a place to mourn. They buried the twins in a quiet cemetery in their hometown, a simple ceremony attended by friends and family, but the ghost of the mystery still lingered. The ghost of Old Man Hemlock, the hermit who had watched them die, was still out there, a phantom in the desert, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never fully solved. The desert, which had kept a secret for 20 years, had finally revealed it. But in its final brutal flourish, it had also created a new legend, a new ghost story, a new kind of haunting that would forever be a part of its silent, unforgiving landscape. The case of the missing twins of Death Valley was closed, but the story was far from over. It was now a part of the desert's chilling folklore, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires, a haunting reminder that some secrets are never meant to be found. The desert keeps its counsel. It watches, it waits, and it allows the stories of those who pass through it to become part of its eternal, silent narrative. Years turned into decades, and the legend of Old Man Hemlock grew with each passing season. He became a phantom in the desert, a whispered name around campfires, a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture too far off the beaten path. Despite the guilty verdict and the relentless efforts of various law enforcement agencies, Hemlock was never found. He had simply melted back into the landscape he knew so intimately, becoming one with the vast, unforgiving expanse of Death Valley. He achieved the ultimate solitude he had always craved, albeit as a convicted murderer. The desert, in its own silent way, had protected its chosen son. The Turner family, though they finally had a grave to visit and a verdict that acknowledged their son's suffering, still carried the burden of the unknown. The unanswered questions about Hemlock's ultimate fate and the true extent of his knowledge about their son's final hours continued to haunt them. They would often visit the remote cliff face where Jake and Sam had carved their names, a pilgrimage to the last known testament of their existence. The names, now weathered and faded by years of sun and wind, remained a poignant, silent memorial. A testament to 2 young lives that had ended far too soon and far too cruelly. The case of the Death Valley twins became a staple in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books. It was a story that captivated audiences, not just for its mystery, but for its profound moral implications. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about human responsibility, the allure of the wilderness, and the fine line between personal freedom and a criminal act of omission. The narrative of Old Man Hemlock, the enigmatic hermit, became a symbol of the untamed spirit of the desert, a dark reflection of humanity's primal desire for isolation and control. As the years stretched on, the official investigation dwindled to a cold case file, reviewed periodically, but with little hope of new leads. Hemlock, if still alive, would have been a very old man, well into his 90s. The general consensus was that he had eventually succumbed to the very desert he had mastered, his body becoming part of the landscape, just as he had always intended. He had chosen his end, a final, defiant act against the society he had so vehemently rejected. But even without a physical presence, Hemlock's ghost continued to loom large over Death Valley. Rangers and experienced hikers would occasionally report strange sightings, a fleeting shadow on a ridge, a distant flicker of a campfire in an impossible location, the faint sound of an old man whistling a forgotten tune on the wind. These were almost certainly psychological echoes, the human mind trying to fill the void of an unresolved ending. Yet they kept the legend alive, a reminder that the desert's mysteries run deeper than just sand and rock. The story of the twins who vanished in Death Valley and whose names were carved into a cliff wall, and the hermit who watched them die, became a permanent part of the park's eerie folklore. It was a story of two brothers' ambitious journey, a wilderness's brutal indifference, and one man's dark choice. It taught a chilling lesson, that some journeys into the wild are not just about conquering nature, but about facing the darker sides of human nature itself. And sometimes, the most profound answers are found not in the solving of a crime, but in the enduring silence of a vast, unforgiving landscape. The desert is a blank tombstone, ready to be filled with the stories of those who dare to enter. But the story of Old Man Hemlock and the Turner twins did not end with the absence of a body. The legend of the hermit convicted in absentia became a national obsession, fueling a search for justice beyond the bounds of the law. The Turner family, in turn, channeled their grief in an unexpected way. Instead of mourning, they became the guardians of their son's memory. They founded the Jake and Sam Turner Foundation, dedicated to educating young adventurers about the dangers of Death Valley and the importance of respecting nature. They transformed a tragedy into a legacy of awareness, ensuring that their son's fate was not in vain. The foundation funded research, installed warning signs on dangerous trails, and even developed a tracking app for hikers to use, alerting them to high-risk areas. It was a way of honoring their sons, who had died from recklessness, but who, in their death, would teach others not to make the same mistake. The symbolic tomb in the city's cemetery became a pilgrimage site for those who followed the story, and each year, hundreds of people would hike to Hemlock's rumored cabin, leaving flowers and notes in memory of the twins. But the legend of Hemlock was not limited to folklore. The searches for him, although unsuccessful, did not cease. FBI agents and the National Park Service Investigation Division maintained Operation Ghost, a team dedicated to capturing Hemlock, or at the very least, finding his body. They used cutting-edge technology, such as drones and satellites with high-resolution cameras, to map every inch of Death Valley. They were convinced that a man his age could not survive indefinitely without assistance, and that he must have a hideout, a hidden refuge. The investigation team, led by Special Agent John Corbin, a veteran with a passion for cold cases, focused on Hemlock's maps. They digitized them, analyzed them with artificial intelligence algorithms, and compared them to modern satellite images. They discovered small discrepancies, routes that Hemlock had drawn with more detail than others, suggesting he had spent more time in those locations. It was a clue, a silent whisper from a man who communicated through paper and ink. Corbin's team concentrated their search on a particularly intriguing location, a narrow, winding gorge that on Hemlock's maps was labeled with a single, enigmatic word: sanctuary. It was an area so remote and dangerous that no search team had ever ventured there. They knew that entering would be risky, but they also knew that if Hemlock was still alive, that's where he would be hiding. The case of the Turner twins was about to have a new chapter, a chapter that would not be written by a diary or a tombstone, but by a team of agents willing to face the desert's wrath and the fury of a man who refused to be found. The cave was a dark breath in the rock face, and in the heart of its silence lay proof that the legend was more real than anyone could imagine. Operation Ghost, led by Special Agent John Corbin, finally reached the Sanctuary Gorge. It was a place that seemed to have been carved by the desert's own wrath, with sheer walls and treacherous passages. The team, comprised of climbing and desert survival specialists, advanced cautiously, using drones to map every inch of the area. Hemlock's maps were their only compass, his ancient lines and symbols guiding them through a labyrinth of rock and shadow. They were on a high-stakes hunt, searching for a man who had become part of the landscape itself. As they progressed, the landscape grew more bizarre. They found strange stone markers, piles of rocks that didn't seem natural, arranged in a way that suggested purpose. And then they found it. Tucked into an almost invisible recess in the gorge wall was the entrance to a cave. This wasn't an ordinary cave. It was a structure that appeared to have been modified, with stones stacked to form a camouflaged entrance. This was the sanctuary. Corbin's team entered the cave with extreme caution. The air inside was cold and dry, carrying a distinct smell of earth and something else, something ancient and almost wild. The cave was surprisingly large, with several interconnected chambers. They found the remains of an old campfire, some rudimentary utensils, and a makeshift bed crafted from animal hides. It was clearly a place where Hemlock had lived, perhaps for decades. And then, in a deeper chamber, they made a discovery that made their hearts pound. On one of the cave walls, carefully carved or drawn, was a series of maps. These weren't the detailed maps of trails and water sources, but different kinds of maps. They were maps of the original search area for the twins, the Golden Canyon Gorge. And on these maps, there were small markings, crosses and circles indicating specific points. And at one of these points, there was a small note in spidery handwriting. The last tier. Corbin's team realized what they were seeing. These weren't survival maps. They were surveillance maps. Hemlock wasn't just living in the desert, he was observing. He had monitored the search for the twins, tracked the authorities' efforts, and even marked the locations where the twins' bodies were buried. The note, "The last tier," at one of the burial spots was a chilling detail, proof of Hemlock's cold indifference. He had watched the despair of the search teams, the family's pain, and he had recorded it all, like a cruel observer. The discovery of the surveillance maps added a new, terrifying layer to the case. Hemlock wasn't just an indifferent hermit. He was a strategist, a man who reveled in his ability to manipulate and deceive. He had used the desert as his playground, and the search for the twins as his personal game. The sanctuary wasn't just a refuge, it was a command center, a place where he had planned and executed his escape. The Turner twins' case was about to take an unexpected turn, a turn that would reveal the true nature of the man who had become a legend in Death Valley. The most dangerous secrets are not the ones kept in darkness, but the ones hidden in plain sight, mocking those who seek them. The discovery of Old Man Hemlock's sanctuary and his surveillance maps turned the entire case on its head. He was not just an indifferent hermit, he was a meticulous observer, a cruel puppeteer who had watched the unfolding tragedy of the Turner twins and the subsequent search with detached amusement. The maps were a chilling revelation, a tangible manifestation of his cold cruelty, but the most terrifying discovery was yet to come. In a small, hidden alcove of the cave, the team found a series of intricately carved wooden figures. They were crudely but recognizably made, each one representing a person involved in the search. There was a small figure of a park ranger, a helicopter, and even a figure of the FBI special agent in charge of the initial search. It was a bizarre, unsettling collection, a silent trophy room of his psychological dominance. And then they found the last figure. It was a figure of a young man, a hiker with a backpack. The figure was split in two, and at its base, carved into the wood, were the initials JT. It was a figure of Jake Turner, a grotesque and final monument to his death. But the most horrifying detail was a small, almost invisible string attached to the figure, a string that led to a small, hand-drawn map of the area where the twins' bodies had been found. It was a macabre game, a final taunting clue left by a man who was already a ghost. The discovery of the figures, and particularly the one of Jake Turner, added a new charge to the case. Not just a crime of omission, but a crime of psychological torment. Hemlock wasn't just indifferent, he was sadistic. The FBI, now armed with a mountain of new evidence, had a new, urgent mission: find the man who had created this sick, elaborate game. They used the information from the maps to re-examine the landscape, this time looking for things that weren't there. They were looking for patterns, for anomalies, for places that Hemlock might have visited or used as a lookout point. They were no longer searching for a needle in a haystack. They were searching for the man who had created the haystack itself. The search became personal. Special Agent Corbin, a man who had seen it all, was now on a mission to catch a ghost, a phantom who had mocked the law for 20 years. The discovery also sent a new wave of shock and grief through the Turner family. The news of the figures, the idea that a man had not only watched their sons die, but had also created a twisted shrine to their deaths, was a new, unspeakable horror. The families, who had found a small measure of peace in the knowledge of their son's burial site, were now plunged back into a world of pain and anger. They demanded that the Operação Fantasma not just find Hemlock, but bring him to justice for the psychological torture he had inflicted on them. The desert, which had been a silent tomb, was now a loud, angry jury. The media, which had once portrayed Hemlock as a tragic figure, a victim of a society he rejected, now painted him as a psychopath, a man who had found a twisted sense of purpose in watching two young men die. The case of the Death Valley twins was no longer just a cold case. It was a horrifying story of a man who had used the vast, unforgiving wilderness as his personal playground, a place where he could play God, watching the lives of two innocent boys slip away. A man who had finally, in his last act of defiance, revealed his true monstrous nature. The desert has no heroes, only survivors, and sometimes the most chilling act of survival is not about staying alive, but about outsmarting the one who wants you dead. The sanctuary was more than a hideout. It was a psychological fortress. The surveillance maps and the macabre collection of carved figures proved that Old Man Hemlock was not just a hermit who had retreated from society, but a man who had actively watched, judged, and tormented it from a distance. The realization that he had not only observed the search for the Turner twins, but had also created a twisted, personal shrine to their deaths, added a new layer of horror to the case. The FBI, now with a personal vendetta, intensified their search. They were no longer looking for a ghost, they were looking for a sadist. But the desert, as always, had its own rules. After weeks of relentless searching, using every piece of modern technology at their disposal, the team hit a wall. Hemlock was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. But Special Agent Corbin, a man who believed that every puzzle had a solution, refused to give up. He decided to go back to the source, back to the one place that held the key to Hemlock's mind, his journal. Corbin spent days poring over the journal, looking for a clue, a pattern, a sentence that would reveal Hemlock's final destination. He found nothing. The journal, which had given them so much, had suddenly become a closed book. But then, an old, almost forgotten detail came to light. In the initial search for the twins, a hiker had reported seeing an old man with a long white beard, carrying a makeshift walking stick, far from any established trail. The sighting had been dismissed as a hallucination, a mirage in the punishing desert heat. Now Corbin saw it differently. He went back to the old report and he found a single solitary detail that had been overlooked. The hiker had mentioned that the man was whistling a tune. Not a simple melody, but a complex, almost haunting tune, a tune that sounded like an old folk song. Corbin, a man with a love for music, immediately recognized the tune. It was an old Appalachian folk song, a song about a man who retreats to the mountains to escape the world. It was a song that was almost entirely forgotten, a song that few people would know. And then he found a record of it. A small community newspaper from a remote, almost forgotten town in the Appalachian Mountains had published a small, almost invisible article about a local legend, an old man who had lived in a cave and had played the same song on a makeshift flute. The man's name was Thomas "Tommy" Hemlock. The desert hermit had a past. He had a family. And he had a home. The FBI, now with a new lead, shifted their focus from the arid, unforgiving landscape of Death Valley to the lush, green mountains of Appalachia. They were no longer looking for a ghost. They were looking for a man who had a history, a family, and a home. The case of the Death Valley twins was about to have its final act, an act that would not be played out in the silent, unforgiving desert, but in a small, quiet town, a town that held a secret more than 100 years in the making. The case was no longer just about the disappearance of two young boys. It was about the dark, haunting secret of a man who had run from his past, only to be found by it in the end. The past is never truly buried. It waits patiently in the shadows, ready to emerge when you least expect it. The new lead on Old Man Hemlock's Appalachian past was a seismic shift in the investigation. He was no longer a phantom born of the desert, but a man with a name, a home, and a family he had left behind. The FBI, now with a new sense of urgency, sent a team to the small, remote town in the Appalachian Mountains. They were looking for any trace of Thomas "Tommy" Hemlock, any surviving relatives, any clue that would lead them to the man who had vanished from his past, only to reappear in a haunting legend. They found it. A small, weathered cabin, nestled deep in the woods, the same cabin that had been described in the old newspaper article. The cabin was abandoned, but it was not empty. Inside, they found a treasure trove of information: old letters, faded photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal, a companion to the one found in the desert. The journal was filled with the same spidery handwriting, but it told a different story. It was the story of a young man, a man named Thomas, a man who was deeply disillusioned with society, with its rules and its expectations. He wrote about his love for the wild, his need for solitude, and his growing disdain for the people around him. He wrote about a tragic event, a local scandal that had shattered his faith in humanity and had driven him to seek a new, solitary life. The scandal, according to the journal, involved a young woman, a local librarian who had been a close friend of Thomas. She had been the victim of a terrible crime, a crime that had been covered up by the local authorities, a crime that had gone unpunished. Thomas had tried to fight for her, but he had been ignored, his pleas for justice dismissed. The experience had broken him, and he had made a decision. He would leave society behind. He would go to a place where the law was not made by man, but by the wild. He would go to the desert. The journal didn't mention her name, but it was clear that the young woman's death was the catalyst for his transformation. The new revelation was a gut punch. The man who had been convicted in absentia for the deaths of two young boys had himself been a victim of a system he had come to despise. He had not just run away from his past, he had run from a profound injustice. His indifference to the deaths of Jake and Sam Turner was not just a product of a twisted mind, it was a deep, ingrained distrust of a society he believed was fundamentally corrupt. The discovery of the journal added a new, tragic layer to the story. The monster of Death Valley was, in fact, a man who had been deeply hurt, a man who had chosen to be the arbiter of his own justice, a man who, in his own mind, was not a villain, but a survivor. The FBI, now with a complete picture of Hemlock's past, had a new, more terrifying understanding of his actions. He was not just a hermit, he was a self-appointed judge, jury, and executioner. He had watched the Turner twins die, not out of sadism, but out of a perverse sense of justice. They had, in his eyes, violated the rules of the wild, a law more ancient and more sacred than the laws of men. They had paid the ultimate price, a price that he, in his own dark way, had deemed just. The case was now more than just a search for a fugitive. It was a journey into the twisted mind of a man who had chosen to live outside the boundaries of human morality. The final act was about to begin, and it would be a confrontation not just between a man and the law, but between two different worldviews, a clash between the rules of society and the unwritten laws of the wild. The weight of a hidden past can bend a man's will, but the burden of a hidden crime can break his spirit. The story of Thomas Hemlock, once a simple hermit, now a fugitive, was becoming a complex tapestry of tragedy, injustice, and twisted morality. The FBI, with the help of the journal found in his Appalachian cabin, was now able to piece together the full narrative. They learned that the young woman, who'd been the victim of the cover-up, was named Elara Vance, a librarian who, in a chilling parallel to Sarah Jenkins, had been a quiet, unassuming soul who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her death had been ruled an accident, but Thomas, who had known her well, knew it was a lie. He had spent months trying to get justice, but the local law enforcement, influenced by a powerful family in the community, had dismissed his claims. Broken and disillusioned, he had fled, not just from the town, but from society itself, seeking a world where his own sense of justice, however warped, could prevail. The discovery of Elara's story was a pivotal moment. It explained Hemlock's profound distrust of society and his seemingly cold indifference to the deaths of the Turner twins. In his mind, they were just another example of a world that was fundamentally flawed, a world where the innocent paid the price for the arrogance of the privileged. He had not just watched them die, he had, in a twisted sense, seen it as a form of natural justice, the wild punishing those who disrespected its power. The two boys, with their hubris and their reckless disregard for the desert's unwritten rules, had, in his eyes, sealed their own fate. The FBI, now with a new perspective, shifted their focus from a simple manhunt to a psychological operation. They knew that Hemlock was a master of his domain, but they also knew that he was a man who was deeply attached to his past. They began to disseminate information about the reopening of Elara's case, a campaign designed to lure him out of his hiding place. The news reports were vague, but they mentioned new evidence, a witness who had come forward, a promise of a new kind of justice. They were baiting a trap, hoping to appeal to the one part of him that was still human, his need for justice, his unfulfilled desire to avenge his friend's death. The strategy was a gamble, but it paid off. A few weeks after the news reports began to circulate, a small, remote post office in a dusty, forgotten town near the edge of Death Valley received a letter. The letter was addressed to Special Agent John Corbin. The handwriting was spidery and almost illegible, but it was undeniably Hemlock's. The letter was short and to the point. It simply said, "The game is over. I am ready to come home." He didn't mention the twins, or Elara, or his crimes. He simply said he was ready to return. He was a man who had chosen to live outside the boundaries of human society, but in the end, the pull of his past, the need to see justice for the one person he had cared about, was a force he could not resist. The case of the Death Valley twins was about to have its final, unexpected act. The man who had been a ghost, a phantom in the desert for 20 years, was about to surrender. Not for his crimes against the Turner boys, but for a crime committed in another time, In another place, a crime that had haunted him for a lifetime. The desert had not killed him, and the law had not found him. In the end, it was a ghost from his own past who had brought him to justice. The story of the twins who vanished and the man who watched them die was finally, after 2 decades, about to have its conclusion. Sometimes, justice arrives not with a roar, but with a quiet surrender, a final acknowledgement that even the desert cannot outrun the ghosts of the past. The letter from Thomas Hemlock, "The game is over. I am ready to come home," was a victory for Special Agent John Corbin, but it was also a moment charged with an unsettling quietude. After 2 decades of being a phantom, Hemlock was finally ready to face the world he had abandoned. The FBI moved swiftly and discreetly. A small, unmarked car met him at the remote post office. The old man who emerged from the dusty building was a shadow of the fierce hermit depicted in the legends. He was frail, his long white beard more sparse, his eyes still holding that deep-seated indifference, but now laced with a profound weariness. There was no struggle, no dramatic chase. Just a quiet, almost anticlimactic surrender. Hemlock was taken into custody without incident. His first demand was to speak with Special Agent Corbin alone. In a sterile interrogation room, far from the vast silence of Death Valley, Hemlock began to tell his story. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, his words punctuated by long silences, as if still listening to the whispers of the desert. He recounted the injustice of Ilara Vance's death, the corruption that had protected her killer, and his subsequent flight from a society he deemed irredeemably flawed. He spoke of his years in the desert, his fierce protection of his solitude, and his twisted belief that the wilderness held a purer form of justice. When asked about the Turner twins, his demeanor hardened. He admitted to watching them, to knowing of their distress, and to possessing the means to save them. But he showed no remorse. "They broke the rules of the wild," he stated, his eyes cold and unblinking. "They came with arrogance, not respect. The desert claimed them, and I was merely a witness to its justice." He spoke of burying their bodies, not out of mercy, but out of a final, perverse act of stewardship, ensuring they would return to the earth as part of the wild they had so carelessly invaded. He even detailed the creation of his trophy room in the sanctuary, explaining it as a chronicle of his observations, a record of humanity's failures against the absolute truth of nature. However, when Corbin finally brought up Ilara Vance, a flicker of something almost human crossed Hemlock's face, a mixture of pain and a long-dormant rage. He recounted the details of her death, naming the powerful local family who had orchestrated the cover-up, revealing long-hidden truths about the night she died. He provided names, dates, and locations, details that only someone intimately involved would know. It was a confession, but not for the crimes he was accused of. It was a desperate plea for justice, for a ghost from his past. The information Hemlock provided about Ilara's case was staggering. It reopened a cold case from decades ago, implicating powerful figures who had long believed themselves untouchable. The legal proceedings that followed were even more complex than those surrounding the Turner twins. Hemlock's testimony, though from a convicted murderer, was precise and damning. It set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of that small Appalachian town and expose a deep-seated corruption that had festered for generations. In the end, Thomas Hemlock faced the music. He was sent to a federal prison, not in the harsh, isolated world he knew, but in a sterile, confined environment, far from the vast skies and silent canyons of Death Valley. He lived out his remaining years within those walls, a stark contrast to the freedom he had once commanded. The saga of the Turner twins and Old Man Hemlock concluded not with a dramatic desert showdown, but with the quiet, unsettling understanding that some monsters are forged not in malice, but in the crucible of profound injustice. and that even in the most remote corners of the earth, the echoes of the past will always find a way to demand their due. The truth, like the desert wind, eventually erases all lies, but it leaves behind a new landscape, one marked by the scars of what has been revealed. The trial of Thomas Hemlock, once a phantom of the desert, became a global spectacle. The media, which had followed his case for 2 decades, now had a new story to tell, not just of a hermit who had watched 2 boys die, but of a man who had sought justice for a ghost from his past. The trial was a legal battlefield, a clash between the prosecution's case, which painted Hemlock as a cold-blooded monster, and the defense's argument, which portrayed him as a man driven to madness by a profound injustice. His testimony, delivered in a quiet, haunting voice, was the centerpiece of the trial. He spoke not of his own innocence, but of the corruption that had shattered his life, and the injustice that had cost Ilara Vance her own. Hemlock's confession about Ilara's death set in motion a separate, equally dramatic legal proceeding. The powerful family he had accused, who had long believed themselves untouchable, were now facing a mountain of evidence, a web of lies and deceit that had been exposed by a man they had dismissed as a simple hermit. The trial was a media circus, a national conversation about privilege, power, and the long, slow march of justice. The town that had long kept its secrets now had its dirty laundry aired for the entire world to see. The killer of Ilara Vance, a man who had lived his life with impunity, was finally brought to justice, all because a man who had chosen to live outside the law had chosen to come home. The Turner family, who had followed the trial with a mixture of hope and trepidation, found a new kind of closure. The man who had taken their sons from them was not a faceless monster, but a human being with a history, a past, and a reason, however warped, for his actions. The discovery of Ilara's story did not erase their pain, but it did give them a sense of understanding. They saw that Hemlock was not just a villain in their story, but a victim in his own. They realized that in his own twisted way, he had been fighting for justice all along. The knowledge that he had finally found it, even if it meant his own confinement, was a small, cold comfort. In the end, Thomas Hemlock was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was hailed as a victory for justice, a message that no one, not even a man living in the most remote corners of the earth, was above the law. But the victory was bittersweet. Hemlock had not been convicted for the reasons the public had originally assumed. He was a murderer, yes, but he was also a man who had brought a long-forgotten killer to justice. The desert had not killed him, and the law had not found him. In the end, it was a ghost from his own past who had brought him to justice. The story of the twins who vanished and the man who watched them die was finally, after 2 decades, about to have its conclusion.